everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Equip Project. We're recording slightly later this week, Jim. Is that because you stayed up late on Monday night to watch the interview with Harry and Meghan?
Well, I am a little sleep deprived, but the Duke and Duchess of Sussex are not to blame. Wild horses wouldn't have dragged me to watch that discussion. I often say that, as a Protestant, I don't subscribe to the doctrine of purgatory. But if I did, I feel sure that it would involve Oprah Winfrey talk for hours to people about their feelings. So I studiously avoided anything to do with that interview, which has the enormous advantage that I don't have to offer an opinion on it.
That's disappointing, and I'm sure our listeners will be disappointed because I imagined you sitting with a large box of popcorn, just really enjoying that interview and embracing the whole drama of it.
How does your truth make you feel?
We'll come to that. But to be honest with you, I think it's probably best we avoid wading into that whole drama. Everyone on Twitter has an opinion on it, so we'll steer clear of that for now. In this third season of the Equip Project, we're looking at various elements that make up our culture. In this episode, I want to think about language, and it might seem an odd thing for us to think about, but the truth is that language has become a real battleground in Western society. So to kick things off, I want to mention an article that was published yesterday in an urban policy magazine in the United States. It was written by a liberal bisexual journalist called Bari Weiss. Weiss begins her article by describing a group of parents who send their children to some of the most elite private schools in Los Angeles. These schools charge an annual fee of around $50,000, and the group of parents met in secret, terrified their identities might leak out on social media. And they came together to express their concern over how their kids are being indoctrinated by the ideologies of the progressive left. And at the heart of that indoctrination is a thing called the language of wokeness. And I just want to read one sentence from that article. I think it's an extraordinary article. It's one I'll link on the website so you guys can read the whole of it. But Weiss says, power in America now comes from speaking woke, a highly complex and ever-evolving language. And to give an example of this new language, Weiss provides a link to a 12-page document that is issued to children and parents at an elite preschool in New York, and it's called Grace Church Inclusive Language Guide. And I read through it earlier this morning, Jim, and it's like a parody. It's almost unbelievable. So nursery-age children are taught not to talk about mum and dad or even about parents. Instead, they must talk about guardians or grown-ups. The term husband or wife should be replaced by the term significant other. And the guide tells 4 and 5-year-olds that in the classroom, it is good practice to state affirming pronouns when introducing oneself. Even words like typical or normal are deemed to be out of date and problematic. The infants are trained in the appropriate way to support someone who's identified as gay. Instead of asking, what religion are you? The children are trained to ask, are there any faith traditions important to you? In her article, Weiss makes the point that both parents and children are terrified of transgressing by not speaking this new language. Fluency in the language is fast becoming an essential prerequisite for anyone hoping to gain entrance into an Ivy League university, and even a slight misstep can lead to social shaming. Jim, what was your take on the article?
Well, I read that article with amazement. Some of these elite schools have a policy where white male children are never allowed to speak first. Critical race theory has begun to influence even the hard sciences, so teens are not allowed to talk about Newton's laws anymore. They must talk of the 3 fundamental laws of physics because, apparently, whiteness needs to be decentered. The point for us, Ollie, is not to have an enjoyable rant against progressive ideologies. It's this idea of the language of wokeness. Language and how we use it has become an immensely powerful factor in how we engage with this culture. It's as if society no longer has a shared stable language. There's this increasing pressure to learn a new language because this new language is the passport that we need to engage in the modern world. To refuse to learn a new language is a decision to be iced out of your social network. And the first thing to say about that state of affairs is that it is very odd. And we should be curious about how we have ended up here.
Yeah, absolutely. The role of language and culture runs very deep, doesn't it, Jim? We're not talking about a superficial bit of political activism here. And in some ways, it was a changing view of language that has driven most of postmodern thought. Is that right?
Yes. The interesting thing about the key thinkers in postmodern thought is that many of them were literary theorists rather than straightforward philosophers. So think of really important thinkers like Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Lyotard, Richard Rorty. A great deal of the big ideas that underpin the ideologies of the progressive left come from thinking about the relationship between language and truth and the relationship between language and power.
And let's then turn to examine those two relationships. I want to ask you first about the relationship between language and truth, and then we'll think about the relationship between language and power. Once we've discussed those two topics, I want to begin or to finish by asking you some practical questions about how we as Christians should speak in this society. And actually, Jim, will address some of the slogans that we hear popularized today, and we'll try and think what should our response be as Christians to some of those slogans, like "love is love," for example. So I said just now that the role of language runs very deep in our culture, but language is also a really profound thing for Christian believers, isn't it? Because we're people of the word, and so the relationship between language and truth is vital for us to understand. So the question is, how should we think about the relationship between language and truth?
Well, think about how the Bible starts, Ollie. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. The first chapter of the Bible drives home time and time again the relationship between language and reality. And God said, "Let there be X," and there was X. Okay? God is a speaking God, and his words correspond perfectly to reality. His words speak things into being. Now, the Apostle John takes up that idea deliberately when he opens up his gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made.
I suppose someone might argue that our language isn't the same as God's. We can't speak things into being, and we can misspeak. We can be mistaken.
That's true. But Genesis 1 and John 1 are giving us a pattern for understanding the relationship between language and truth. The divine Logos underwrites the effectiveness and purpose of language. So when we speak, we participate in, we benefit from this God-given correspondence between words and things in the world. The structure of our language reflects the structure of our world. When you think of that relentless drumbeat in Genesis 1, God said, and it was so. When you have that ringing in your ears, you can now appreciate the spine-chilling horror of Satan's words to Eve in chapter 3. Did God really say? Because here we're seeing the first lie, okay? The moment when language is misused to create structures that do not correspond to reality. Before that fateful moment, God had trained Adam in how to use language. He got him to name the animals. Now, I don't exactly know what sound Adam made with his mouth when he pointed to a giraffe and created a linguistic label. You know, if you had been in Eden, you would have pointed at a big, strong plant thing growing out of the soil, and you'd have made the sound tree. An ancient Roman would have pointed at the same thing and said the word arbor. The sound itself is arbitrary, but that doesn't mean that language has no connection to truth. Both you and the ancient Roman are pointing at the same thing, whether you make the sound tree or the sound arbor.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what you're arguing is that the words in each language correspond to the truth of the world around us. Language is so powerful because we all know that the sounds we make produce some authoritative take on the world. Words, in effect, reveal the the structure of reality to us.
Yes. But that huge assumption is only valid if there is a logos. It only makes sense for language to correspond to reality if human language is patterned after the logos who says, let there be X, and there is X. So now think what happens when we delete the logos, when we remove God from our worldview. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche is famous for proclaiming the death of God, and he was quick to see the implications of that move for language. He described truth, in a really famous phrase, he described truth as a mobile army of metaphors. For the naturalist, that's all it is. We can't say any longer that language points to anything real anymore. If there is no God, if there is no principle of correspondence, then we can't be sure that there is any relation between language and objective truth. The thing we call truth might just be a relation created by our language, not something we have discovered about the world. We simply can't know, if there is no God, whether the sense we make of the world is real or not. It might just be language that has joined up the dots, and we call the joined up thing truth. Maybe everything is just a metaphor.
And that idea sounds, well, difficult to understand for one, and also a bit frightening. But at its simplest level, Nietzsche was arguing that when we talk about things like goodness and beauty and truth, we might not be talking about real things at all. We're just thinking about constructs produced by language. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Yes. Now, you're right, it's difficult. So to try and earth all that theory, let me take a really poignant example of what happens when you give up on the relationship between language and truth. Last week I listened to a podcast between Jordan Peterson and an intellectual called Jonathan Pageau. Pageau is a member of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and he at least affirms the historic claims of Christianity. He may be a genuine believer, I don't know. Anyway, he was discussing an issue with Jordan Peterson that you and I, Ollie, have highlighted in our episode on Peterson last season. When you listen to the podcast, you realize that Peterson sounds tortured these days. He gives the sense of a man who is in real mental turmoil. Now, the strange thing is, he sees the explanatory power of the Christian story. He sees the power of the narrative, or the richness of the myth, to use more technical language. But he will not accept that the story actually happened. Okay? He seems to run away every time he is confronted with the question, do you believe that Jesus Christ actually lived and died and rose again? He could talk for hours about Christ as the cosmic ideal. He does talk for hours about that. But he becomes really agitated whenever he is confronted by the relationship between the language of the Christian narrative and its objective truth. Now, as I listened to him, a story from the Bible came into my mind. It's the story of Jacob wrestling with God, recorded in Genesis chapter 32. And I think that is such an important story for unbelievers these days. Searching for God is like wrestling with a real person. You must contend with God as a real, living, and personal being. But Peterson is like a man wrestling with thin air. Because he won't ever step outside of the text, because he won't accept the link between language and truth, he will forever be tortured and tormented. A madman vainly beating the air. Now, that might seem like a weird illustration of the topic we're discussing, Ollie, but I think it illustrates the disastrous turn our society has made in rejecting the link between language and truth. The most famous thinker in this space is Jacques Derrida, who famously said that there is nothing outside of the text. And what he meant by that phrase, which is often misunderstood, he meant that there is nothing outside of our experience to show us how to interpret our experience. So he rejects the idea of the logos. There is nothing outside of the natural world of experience that can reveal the meaning of life to us.
And as Christians, I guess the obvious response to that is the incarnation, isn't it? The Word becoming flesh. In Christ, God entering into our world of experience. John describes God God incarnate in his first letter, and he uses these words. He says, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and have touched with our hands." All very objective language.
Exactly. Derrida argues that no one can climb up the greasy pole of language to encounter objective truth. Now, Christians just shrug their shoulders at that argument. Why? Because we say that God slid down the greasy pole of language and came to us. In the Bible, we see God condescend to communicate with us using the cultural artifacts of Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. It is those words that allow us to wrestle with the absolute, to contend with God. Derrida never even considered that idea. So he condemns himself and us to an endless circulation of meanings within the world of experience.
Okay, Jim, so we've thought about the relationship between language and truth. Our culture has rejected the link between language and truth, and so we have jettisoned the idea that things like goodness and beauty and truth are objectively real. We just have to live in this continual flux where we construct a meaning for each cultural moment. But you also mentioned that there is an important link between language and power. What is that link, and why does it matter?
Okay, well, let's go back to the article you mentioned at the start of this conversation, Ollie. Why would a school board issue a 12-page document to infants and to their parents which bans words like mom and dad and replaces them with the word guardian? Why would educationalists insist that children are never lined up as boys and girls in the playground, but are distinguished by arbitrary factors like the colour of their shoes? Well, in a world where language is no longer connected to truth, all you're left with is power. So language becomes an instrument of power. Within the ideology known as critical theory, we are asked, as we discussed in the episode that you forgot, we are asked to accept that society is structured as a white oppressor and minority groups such as women, the LGBT community, and black people. And according to critical theory, white men maintain their hold on power not by using brute force, but by creating social norms and institutions that keep the minority groups on the margins of society. And one of white men's most brilliant inventions, we are told, is the nuclear family. By normalizing the idea of a husband and wife with biological children raised in a stable and loving household, the white heteropatriarchy successfully labels those who reject that structure as deviant or abnormal. Okay, now, when you view life through that lens, you can suddenly see why school teachers are banning infants from talking about mom and dad. Language has become an instrument of power. And so the only way the white heteropatriarchy can be subverted is to create a new language, the language of the woke. And by training everyone to speak this new language, the repressive structures of the heteropatriarchy can be subverted. Even concepts like gender and womanhood can be obliterated.
In one of our recent talks at church, Jim, a recent series we did kind of along this theme, you mentioned the NHS had made a decision to replace the term breastfeeding with chest feeding. And I suppose the obvious question is, how do we get to this point in society? How has this new language been effectively smuggled into all our institutions like this?
Well, as ever with the progressive left, the campaign began as an expression of victimhood. The real game only came into the open very recently. So we need to go back 20 or 30 years. In 1993, an important document called Words That Wound was published. It argued that hate speech can cause severe psychological trauma. So suddenly, words were given an extraordinary physical power. I remember once watching a video of a young black student in Yale University, and she was sobbing in uncontrollable rage because her faculty teacher had not protected her from other students who wore Halloween costumes. He hadn't stepped in to prevent them from wearing sombreros and feathered headdresses. Now, the interesting thing was this. The lecturer tried to use arguments based on freedom of expression to defend himself. But the girls shouted at him, "It's not about free speech. It is not. Do you understand that? It's about creating a home here. You're not doing that for me." Now, that is astonishing when you think that 30 years earlier, around about 1964, wasn't it, at the front gates of Berkeley University in California, student protesters jumped up and down on police cars as part of their defense of the free speech movement on campus. They sang songs about being prepared to go to prison in order to defend free speech. But look at what has happened. Speech has been weaponized. Language is now seen as an instrument of power, of violence. So anyway, that was phase one of the campaign, if you like. The left persuaded society to jettison its commitment to freedom of speech because language was now seen as an instrument of violent power.
And you can see that move very clearly on university campuses. There's been no platforming of a number of individuals, feminists like Germaine Greer, Julie Bindel, and the gay rights campaigner Peter Tatchell, just a few of those names. We can think about the terms that have become accepted into mainstream campus life. So phrases like safe space, microaggressions, trigger warnings, privilege checking, and cultural appropriation. All those terms are kind of very familiar to us.
Yes, my favourite example of emotional fragility is about the announcement. This is true. You're not made to believe this, but it is true. There's an announcement made at the NUS Women's Conference a few years ago, which said, some delegates are requesting that we move to jazz hands rather than clapping, as it's triggering anxiety. But the campaign has moved on from that victim posture in recent years. The progressive left is no longer simply playing the political correctness cards. It's now aggressively redefining language in order to tear down social structures like the family and marriage. In fact, I think we've now got to the point where language is now being used to redefine reality. I mean, you mentioned the NHS language around breastfeeding just now. Now, that language game is attempting to redefine biological realities. Think of the arrogance of that move. And the Grace Church School Board said there is no gender and there was no gender. In other words, our culture is taking on the role of God, using language to create our own reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been a lot of like hard thinking in this discussion. It's certainly bending my mind as I try and think it through. But as we kind of come to the end of this episode, Jim, I want to ask you some practical questions about how we should speak in a society like this one. I think it's really difficult because we obviously have to communicate in a society like this. So how do we actually go about it? So I want to think of the general principles involved, and then I want to ask you some really practical questions about pronouns and slogans. But let's think about the principles that should govern our speech. I guess a way to kind of introduce this is to ask, does the Bible support freedom of speech?
Well, free speech is a political concept. It's not necessarily a biblical one. In fact, the Bible sets out a much more balanced view of speech, one that is more sympathetic to those who argue that words can wound. On the one hand, it argues consistently for truth to be heard in the public square. Isaiah cries out that truth has stumbled in the streets. But on the other hand, the Bible sets many, many limits on our speech. It condemns lying, slander, malicious talk, and gossip. The Bible has strong words to say about those who use words to stir up trouble. The New Testament says, "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear." One of the most important sayings in the book of Proverbs is this. Every young adult should learn this verse off. Reckless words pierce like a sword, but the words of the wise bring healing. The verse in Scripture which best summarizes the Christian view of public speech is found in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 15. Paul says, "Rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ." Now, I'm sure you can see the lovely balance in that simple phrase, speak the truth in love. So that's the general principle.
Yeah, that's really useful, Jim, and it is so wonderful to hear those scriptural truths against this backdrop. Just brings such clarity, doesn't it? When set against the kind of things we've been thinking about. So that's the general principle. Let's think about a few practical examples then. Should we use preferred pronouns when we meet a transgender person?
Personally, I think we should, because although we disagree with transgender philosophy, we respect transgender people as persons made in the image of God. So here's a simple principle. If someone presents themselves to me as a man, then I treat them as a man. So the answer to that question, from my perspective at any rate, is yes.
One of the real problems teenagers have to face is that the war over language is fought using slogans, as I mentioned earlier. Really powerful, simple slogans that can be hard to counter because on the surface they seem to make a lot of sense, and it's kind of like, how could you argue with that? So I want to list a few slogans, fire them at you, and ask how we should respond. Obviously, this won't be comprehensive, but just kind of a brief response to each. So let's start with probably the most famous one, love is love.
Well, that slogan says that all love is sexual love. But no one believes that. We can all think of loving relationships that are not sexual. So no one believes that love is love. Affection, friendship, filial love, and erotic love are all distinctive forms of love, and those distinctives are part of love's essence. So it isn't just Christians who don't believe that all love should be sexually expressed. No one believes that unless they're utterly sick.
Second slogan is my body, my choice.
Well, even if that statement is true, it's irrelevant. The unborn child is not part of the mother's body. Science is on our side here. Every medic listening knows that the mother's immune system doesn't treat the unborn child as one of its own organs, or as a parasite, or a tumour. It is accorded the unique status by the mother's body as another body that is to be protected and nurtured. So my body, my choice may be true, but it is irrelevant.
Gay by birth, proud by choice.
That's a very interesting one. That slogan anchors identity in biology, obviously. So, it contradicts transgender ideology completely. Gay and lesbian people say, this is who I am, I cannot change. Transgender people say, this is who I am, I must change. Well, which is it? Does biology determine identity or not?
Some people are gay, get over it.
Some people believe in objective morality. Get over it.
A succinct response to that one. Some people say, maybe use the hashtag equal marriage.
For two things to be equal, they must be part of the same set. So the colour orange is neither equal nor unequal to the chord of C# minor, because they're completely different things. Biblical marriage is a unique institution, so it's neither equal nor unequal to anything else. Those who argue for equal marriage have already redefined marriage simply to be a loving, committed relationship between two consenting adults. But that isn't what marriage is. So stop redefining biblical concepts to suit your own ends.
Black Lives Matter.
Every black life is important and valuable. Okay, so my version of the slogan maintains its truth while distancing itself from a political movement dedicated to the destruction of the family, which BLM is. Roads
must fall.
Okay, not everyone will be familiar with that. That's referring to the campaign to tear down the statue of Cecil Rhodes, okay? So when someone says roads must fall, my response is Darwin must fall. My point is, if you want to tear down racist figures from the past, then start with Charles Darwin. He did more to foment biological racism than any other figure in history. So roads can fall after every statue of Charles Darwin has been torn down.
Some people will say, you only say that, whatever that is, because you hate me or fear me.
I don't hate you. I don't fear you. I just think your philosophies are stupid. No, I said that tongue-in-cheek. In fact, it's a general point, Ollie. We're not counselling young adults to fight slogans with slogans. As I said a minute ago, we should speak truth and love. So only use some of those suggestions when you have a twinkle in your eye and you're talking to the people who know that you like and respect them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are obviously very brief responses, sound bites in a way, but these conversations need to happen in the course of an ongoing relationship with our friends, where it's clear that we love them and we speak the truth to them in love. But I think it's helpful just to get a sense of maybe the direction we might take when it comes to some of these slogans. Thank you, Jim. It's been a really enlightening episode, and certainly it's raised a lot of questions in my mind and things I want to think more about. And I'm sure that's the same for our listeners. So if you do have questions, please do get in touch with us via Instagram or via our email address, theequipproject@gmail.com. We're going to post some additional resources for this episode on the website. And yeah, we'd love it if you'd share this episode with friends and family. And also, if possible, review the podcast on Apple Podcasts. We'd love to get more and more people listening to this content if possible. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you all again next week.